Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this 20th Burntwood Lecture. This is the Institution of Environmental Sciences' annual opportunity for an eminent speaker to talk about an important contemporary environmental issue. Good evening, my name is Julie Hill. I have the privilege of being the chair of IES and a somewhat sobering reflection that my career spans nearly 40 of the IES's 50 years. Just a little bit of housekeeping to start with. There's no fire alarm test scheduled for today. So if you hear the fire alarm, please exit the building by the main stairs you came up, or in the event of those being blocked, there's a second exit behind the stage here. Now, tonight's event is being streamed live on YouTube. If you have social media open, the hashtag for tonight's event is hashtag Burntwood22, all one word. And we really encourage you to post reflections and photos. The lecture is being recorded and will be made available on the IES YouTube channel after the event. So the Burntwood Lecture has featured many fantastic speakers over the years, including Lord Deben, Jonathan Porritt, Bob Watson, Tony Juniper, and Julius Lingo. Tonight, we will be welcoming Caroline Lucas MP, talking on the theme of renewable or radioactive, lessons for the environmental sector. But before we welcome Caroline, we want to do two things. One is to hear from a panel of younger voices, because they are the future of environmentalism. But before that, I want to take a quick look back at how the IES has developed over its 50 years. So for those not familiar with IES, here's a short description. We exist to provide environmental professionals with the support they need to make a difference in their working lives, but also to use the voices of those professionals to make change at the level of policy as well as practice. In this way, we are supportive, reflective, and influential. It's no small task to get a 50-year view. I know it is one of Adam, our CEO's deep regrets that he hasn't had more time this year to interrogate our rich archive, but we do know enough to give a potted history of some of the milestones in the development of the institution. The Institution of Environmental Sciences was founded as a result of an initiative by one Dr. John Rose during a series of meetings held during 1971 to 72 at the Royal Society in London, which were chaired by Lord Burntwood, Labour peer and former MP, the namesake of this lecture. John Rose was director of Blackburn College of Technology and Design. He fled Poland to escape the Nazis, lost most of his family in the Holocaust, and his only surviving close relative was his older brother. During the Second World War, he served in the British Army prior to starting a career in further and higher education. John was an energetic individual with broad interests who founded and edited 7 international journals and was editor of more than 50 books spanning interests in everything from cybernetics to medical biotechnology and, of course, environmental issues. So that sense of the interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, rich bringing together of subjects was right there at the core with John Rose. And so in 1972, which was a decade on from the publication of Rachel Carson's seminal book, Silent Spring, and in the wake of the dreadful Minamata Bay mercury poisonings in Japan, there was still not one government department in the world with environmental responsibility. So only 50 years ago, not one governmental department dedicated to the environment, which is extraordinary to think of now. And yet 1972 was a momentous year for raising that political and public consciousness. This included the 1972 UN Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm, often referred to as the Stockholm Conference, which instigated the decadal cycles of UN conferences seeking global consensus and action around what we now call sustainable development. This pivotal year also saw the publication of the influential Club of Rome report, The Limits to Growth. Aren't we still talking about the limits to growth? And the founding of the UN Environment Programme as well. Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth were slightly ahead. They were both founded in 1971. So it's starting to produce a groundswell. So the founding of IES in 1972 was also part of that birth of modern environmentalism. The institution's founding members foresaw that a professional association was needed to support both the academics teaching the emerging discipline of environmental science and the new scientific professions that would certainly grow across government and industry to support this rising tide of environmental concern and consciousness. And therefore, when we look back at the history of the IAS in our 50th anniversary year, we consider our evolving role in relation to the development of the environmental sector as a whole. The idea of forming the institution was not supported by the then Secretary of State for the Environment, Peter Walker, who felt it was, and I quote, not yet clear how your institution will fit into the already well-established pattern of societies and institutions. And he said, I should prefer to stay on the sidelines, but I should watch the institution's development with great interest. I wonder what he would have thought now. IES held its first meeting in 1972, and the inauguration took place in the House of Lords on the 18th of January 1973, and was attended by 120 guests. At this meeting, the institution became established as a professional body, a charity, and a company. And this launch was accompanied by a press release from Lord Burntwood that stated, the multiplicity now, I guess, of organisations, journals, and publicity concerning environmental matters in general, and pollution in particular, has caused bewilderment in some people's minds, and almost certainly impatience at the apparent overlapping and waste of effort. One aspect of the general view that the fight against pollution in all its forms justifies perseverance and patience is the establishment of standards. That's the key word there, standards of professional environmental scientists, to promote educational effort in this country, to coordinate scientific information activity, and to sponsor and promote research in environmental sciences. And that encapsulates what IES was designed to deliver. At that time, membership was £2, very modest. So those early years were mostly spent running conferences, ones I would have loved to have gone to, environmental education, key issues for the future, one looking at both the Potomac and the Thames River Basin studies, which took place between Washington and London. Adam, there's an idea. Tourism in the environment, held in Jersey, as well as publishing books and journals. In October 1976, the institution launched the Environmental News Sheet, which was intended to appear every month except July and August, presumably to fit in with the editor's holidays. It was posted to members at the beginning of the month and included information on new legislation, new courses, current research, social science and education, as well as information of a general kind. These days, our electronic newsletter still gives members the latest news, but our team doesn't get a 2-month hiatus for the summer, I'm afraid. And then in 1981, the Environmentalist Journal was launched in partnership with Elsevier, under the initiative of several IES Council members, after a very successful IES International Conference on Environmental Education in Bern in Switzerland. But the journal's early years proved difficult. International material for inclusion was hard to find. This was the first, believe it or not, environmental journal of its type internationally. In 1995, the journal was sold to a new publisher, but by that time, we'd already launched our own Environmental Scientist Journal, which started in 1992 and runs quarterly to this day. Our modern journal takes a thematic approach, examining one topic in depth, the pressing importance to environmental science. Whereas back in 1992, the first journal, only 12 pages long, comprised a much broader range of topics, seeking to reflect all aspects of the work of the institution. The range and variety of environmental science discipline covered by IES members today would never fit into 12 pages, which is a testament to the power of IES to bring an ever-increasing range of voices together under one banner. This next bit, I thought this makes us sound very establishment, but there is a relevance. The Duke of Westminster was installed as president in 1989, a post he'd held for 25 years. But this enabled us to have offices in Fitzrovia, as did many charities at that time, due to the Duke of Westminster's largesse. Our CEO remembers it came as quite a shock when this came to an end, and we started having to pay the whole cost of our London rent. So now just a little bit about our key role in environmental education. In 1987, the institution began running an institution diploma in conjunction with Farnborough College. The first year of the course was full-time and led to a BTEC qualification. The second year was part-time by distance learning, and students submitting a lengthy report And at the end of the year, the student gained the diploma of the institution in advanced environmental practice. So that was the beginning. 6 years later, in 1993, the IES Further Education and Higher Education Accreditation Scheme began in earnest. We would discover another organisation called the Committee of Heads of Environmental Sciences, otherwise known as CHES, whose leader is here with us today, which ran a similar accreditation scheme. So we started collaborating on joint accreditation, working more and more closely until we effectively merged in 2012. Now, the organisation administers the largest accreditation scheme of university degrees in the world, accrediting 140 programmes across 48 institutions. Our accreditation scheme has raised the standards of environmental education around the world, ensuring that the vital components of a good environmental science programme, such as fieldwork, practical lab skills, and employability skills, are embedded within programmes. Recently, the accreditation has been updated to include equality, diversity, and inclusion criteria, not before time. In 1999, the IES received a grant from what was then the Department of Environment, Transport and the Regions, and in conjunction with other bodies, we started a professional practice for sustainable development project, which established professional training for sustainable development across a broad range of professional institutions. At that time, our analysis was that there were little high-quality sustainability training available to professionals and a pressing need to embed sustainability across professions. We engaged with companies such as Barclays and Tesco's and produced training materials that were sent to numerous SMEs around the country. And now you can think with the proliferation of consultancies who provide training for professionals in sustainability, it seems extraordinary to think that there was so little resource only that length of time ago. And then in the 1990s, the ES was instrumental in helping the Council of Science and Technology transition to being the Science Council and achieve its Royal Charter to award the Chartered Scientist qualification. We were also one of the 7 membership organisations that came together to found the Society for the Environment, which received its Royal Charter to award the Chartered Environmentalist qualification in 2004. And the organisation has gone on to award 11,000 professional registrations, many through IES, raising standards of professionalism within the sector, and going on to launch in November 2002 the Institute for Air Quality Management. So IUQM are also celebrating this year with their 20th anniversary. This has flourished as its own organisation within the IES with a thriving membership and an active governing committee. The IUQM has been a forum for exploring the full spectrum of emerging and often intransigent air quality problems. And we know that, again, these are not on a good trend, and the IUQM, I think, is ever more needed for its insight. It's been very innovative, it's led the way with many new membership services, and provided a model for the establishment of other communities within the IES, meaning that today we have communities in environmental impact assessment, in education through CHES, land condition, marine and coastal, and climate action, and will soon be joined by a water community, completing our set of systemically oriented communities and experts. And so while quietly improving the quality of environmental education in the UK through all these initiatives, the IES was developing a public presence. The first of these Burntwood Lectures was given in November 1994 by Professor David Bellamy on the topic of environmental crisis, seeking answers. We were talking crisis then, as we are now. The lecture continues to this day and has attracted many prestigious speakers. Our policy work and advocacy government also draws on the astonishing network of expertise, experience and goodwill that we've amassed over the years, connecting interdisciplinary voices from across the environmental sciences with the policy that shapes environmental outcome. The IES's governance has also matured. In March 1995, we reduced the council from a maximum of 40, which I could not have dealt with, to 30, and now we have a really manageable 11 on our council, and I thank all the council members for their continuous support and expertise. We have a strong emphasis now on promoting diversity in everything we do. I'm very conscious that environmentalism is, and I hope one day I can say, has been one of the least diverse professions in this country. And at IES, we really hope to change that. And now one of our most important developments. In 2006, a young and bushy-tailed Adam Donnan was taken on as an unpaid volunteer, taking over as the sole paid member of the IES staff part-time in December of that year. At the time, the membership stood at 760. Adam's aim was to grow the membership and revenues of the organisation so it could support more professional staff. To that end, electronic newsletters were launched, student membership added to our offering, the journal modernised, workshops launched to make us the ideal place to undertake chartership, new events delivered, and additional revenue streams added. This was all very hard work. The move from 1 to 2 to 3 employees took a long time, but then the institution gained a momentum of its own, meaning we now have a professional staff of 11. Many of the staff that supported this growth are here today, and I thank them for all their contributions in making it a success. But it is Adam that has brought all this together. Which brings us, you can clap in a minute. Clap now, okay. You'll clap now. Which brings us, you'll be glad to know, to the present day. After 50 years, the IES is a thriving institution with nearly 6,000 members. We are the fastest growing environmental institution in the UK. Earlier this year, we took over another body, the Foundation for Water Research, which has increased our capacity in water, meaning we can have a truly holistic and systemic approach to the environment, building on strengths in land and air. With an average age of 34, an increasingly diverse membership, increasing political influence, and ambitious plans, I'm confident that we can achieve a lot over the next 50 years. However, a history of the institution that just talks about events and outputs fails to capture the people that have made this organisation such a success. It's down to the dedication of staff, trustees, and active members that give up huge amounts of their personal time to making a thriving organisation. And that's why I'm so pleased to see so many of your faces here today so that we can celebrate together. Some of our network have kindly recorded video testimonials marking our 50th anniversary, so we're just going to show you those quickly now.
Today we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Institution of Environmental Sciences with some help from our friends across the sector.
It's with great pleasure I congratulate the IES on its 50th anniversary.
I'm wanting to congratulate the Institute for Environmental Sciences on your 50th anniversary.
I'm delighted to add my voice to those celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Institute for Environmental Sciences.
I just wanted to congratulate you all on your 50th anniversary. What an extraordinary achievement. Your institution in its 50th year has more life in its veins than any other that I can think of.
I wanted to say thank you to all of the IES staff, the trustees and the vice presidents who've made the IES what it is today.
50 years later, what a change in awareness, public awareness and professional awareness of environmental science, and the IES has had a role in that shift. And I'm proud to have had a small part in that initiative too.
I'd like to congratulate the IES on reaching its half century.
Congratulations and happy 50th anniversary, IES!
I am really glad to be working with IES.
I wanted to add my congratulations to everybody for your huge success over the last 50 years and to wish you all the very best for the future.
I'm delighted to join the institution in celebrating its 50th anniversary and wishing you all the best for the next, really for the planet, crucial 50 years.
The environmental science is the foundation on which all of the policy and law that protects our environment is built.
Over those 50 years, environmental science has gone from really a very niche profession to something that is extraordinarily important. And the IES does a wonderful job of bringing together the whole profession and providing the support that it needs.
I hate to admit it, but I've been working in the environmental movement for 40 years now, and we've seen such changes, we've seen huge challenges, we've also seen great progress. One of the most important things actually has been the development of science to help us understand what we're talking about and to make progress by being able to lobby effectively for better change.
The IES is the UK's first dedicated professional body for environmental sciences. Since joining the board in 2016, I've seen it go from strength to strength, with a growth in membership numbers, establishment of new community groups, and diversifying into new environmental sectors.
Back 20 years ago, I and a small number of air quality professionals decided to found the IEQM, working closely in partnership with the IES. Back then, I could never imagine that 2 decades later, the IEQM would be such a strong and thriving organisation with over 600 members and making its contribution to air quality management. We could never have succeeded, however, without the solid support and enthusiastic commitment of our IES colleagues. And I'd like to recognise their contribution in making the IEQM what it is today.
I am very thankful for the IES. Over the years, it's been a great place for me to network, learn about projects in the industry, and learn more. And I love that.
I've been a member for a number of years and couldn't live without my Environmental Scientist magazine, which I read from cover to cover.
I won't be, I'm afraid, around in 50 years' time to send a follow-up message, but what I will be quite sure about is that IES will continue to provide excellent training skills and recognition for the environmental scientists that we so desperately need if we're to preserve living on a habitable planet.
5,700 of you that comprise the IES basically represent all the skills, all the talents for the measurement of all that is important, good and systemic that make up what makes this single planet home of ours that we're trying to save.
In this rapidly changing world, it's more important than ever to root policy and policy change in sound science, and that's what you've been doing since you were set up.
When I chaired the Environmental Audit Subcommittee in Parliament, and subsequently in my work, including with the NHS, it's vital that we tackle the issues of environment and health and bring them all together. What we have to do, though, is find a way of speaking with one voice.
There's a long way to go. We've got climate change, we've got sewer overflows, we've got soil damage and so on. So there's no shortage of issues to investigate.
We need to be able to make sure that we've got the skills in order to meet the environmental challenges of the future. And that's why I'm really glad to be working with IES.
So thank you for all you've done.
Thank you again.
Thank you, IES.
If I had a glass, I'd raise it to you. May you have another 50 very healthy years ahead.
Thank you.
Long live the IES.
Congratulations, and here's to our next 50 years.
Many happy returns and happy birthday.
Today, we take it for granted that all governments have departments with environmental responsibilities and that the language of sustainable development is embedded across society, the language, if not always the action. Businesses increasingly recognise their social and environmental responsibilities, the leading ones of those through proactive recognition of the benefits of doing that, the laggards by at least compliance, in most cases, with a regulatory system that was largely absent 50 years ago. In that regard, the world is profoundly changed, albeit imperfectly, recognising the interconnected environmental and social ramifications of human activities. Other perspectives of the world in 2022 compared to 1972 are more sobering. The global human population over that time has doubled from around 3.8 to 7.9 billion people, with the urban population rising from 37 to 54%, so that now most people live in cities, and consumption in rich countries has ramped up. Per capita meat consumption has soared by nearly 60%, and the number of cars on the world's roads has grown to 1.2 billion. All of these are indicators of intensifying pressure on ecosystems. And so it's really, unfortunately, no surprise that global forest cover, fishery viability, climate stability, and biodiversity are on steeply downward trajectories. Alarmingly, growing knowledge and increasingly comprehensive legislation still sit side by side with declining environmental health, resilient and supportive capacities. So that's the much less favourable picture of the last 50 years. And so 2022 is a moment in history. It is a chance to celebrate the substantial societal changes in environmental and social awareness witnessed since 1972. When I started my career, nobody believed climate change was real. We just discovered the hole in the ozone layer, and that was enough for most people. Yet viewed as a midpoint in a century-long process of cultural transformation, we clearly have a great deal more to do. So our tone of this 50th anniversary is celebratory but not congratulatory. There's still much work to be done. Mindful of this, we've organised a panel debate of younger speakers looking forward to the next 50 years, because, as I said at the outside, the future lies with them. So perhaps you could join me in welcoming them to the stage. Two are with us, one will be remote, and we will discuss the future. Please. Well, welcome both. I'm hoping, good, okay, we do have Sophie. I was just saying, given the tech glitch just now. Sophie, hello, can you hear and see us? You can, excellent. Okay, well, I will introduce you first, because I'm sad to say Phoebe Hansen, who was going to join us from Force for Nature, is sadly unwell. We wish Phoebe our very best, but Sophie Palmer has very kindly decided, has been able to stand in for us. With us, we have Vibs Bhatia, who is Senior Sustainability and ESG Consultant at EY, and also founder of South Asians for Sustainability, and El Andrade May, who is Youth Climate Activist for Education and Green Skills, I got that right, with roles at Teach the Future and SOS, Students Organising for Sustainability UK. And so we're very pleased to have you both with us. So it would just be really helpful, and I'll start with you, Al, if you could just tell us a little bit about your organisations and the work you do, and just sort of position for everybody, what you're doing on the agenda.
So I'm a student. I'm now at university, but I started with Teach the Future back just at the beginning of COVID, and it was quite a new campaign at the time. And so I was in sixth form at the time. And so Teach the Future is a student-led campaign of young people from about 14 to about 25 or so to get climate education into the curriculum. And as well as this, to provide teachers the training that actually makes them feel empowered and capable of teaching students in a way that then empowers students, so that they can go out and make these changes in the world and not feel so scared about climate change. We also campaign to decarbonise the school estates, so that all students learn in an environment that's actually sustainable, and to equip all students with skills that means that they can go into careers that they feel are sustainable and aren't contributing to worsening climate change. And so Teach the Future is a student-led campaign to do all of these things, and is hosted by Students Organising for Sustainability UK.
Okay, thank you. And as I understand it, I mean, when we think about IES, we make quite a lot of being interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary. But as I understand it, Teach the Future is saying there is no discipline that shouldn't have
Absolutely.
a component of environmental education. Is that right?
Yes. So currently what we face is that whenever we take this to the government or the Department for Education, they say, here it is, it's in geography, it's in chemistry, there's a page of it there, perfect, absolutely what we need. Mm-hmm. But that's not true. Not all students take geography at GCSE level, and in chemistry it's so small that it often gets skipped over when teachers are rushing to get all of the curriculum done in time for exams. And so we say that actually you're missing out so many students who maybe aren't as capable in these subjects or just aren't interested in them. And I'm sure you're all a room of people who really like science, and that's why you're here. So it might be hard to hear. But some students do really, really well in the arts. And what we need are students who are capable of exploring these issues and using empathy and connecting with other cultures through music and art and literature. and that you're not going to get that if you confine climate education to the sciences, and that it impacts all aspects of life. It must impact all aspects of our education too.
Okay, and are there big barriers to doing this, do you think, or do you think everyone will catch on and utilise these resources immediately, or is it going to be a struggle?
It's a big question, that, and if it was easy to do, it would have happened already. And so there's a lot of opposition to it, because when we talk with the Department for Education, they say the curriculum's full. If you want this in, we'll have to take something else out. Of course, they're not going to do that. But what we say is that actually it's already almost there. You just don't quite say it. And so on languages, I remember when I did German GCSE, there was a unit on world issues, and you basically learnt the word for there's noise pollution, there aren't enough trees, poverty is bad, and world issues, climate change. I mean, you could talk about it and how people of different cultures, and with the cultures of the languages you're learning to speak, how they experience it, and the different methods from their cultures for connecting with nature and the other people around them. And there's such a missed opportunity throughout all of the curriculum. And yes, it's going to be difficult to get that in, make the first steps, but once you start looking in an interdisciplinary way, you start actually seeing how climate does bridge all of these gaps between the curriculums, the different subjects, and that actually once you get going, it could happen really quickly.
Well, that's good to hear. I'm going to come to Sophie next. Sophie, tell us about Force for Nature, and give us a sense of your work and some of the challenges and successes.
Sure, thank you. So Force of Nature, we're a youth non-profit mobilising mindsets for climate action. So we work mainly with young people to really channel feelings of eco-anxiety into agency. So eco-anxiety can be defined by feelings of fear, of despair, of doom, real fear for the future. But they're not necessarily, we shouldn't assign value judgments to these feelings. So they may be difficult, but they're not bad. They're indicative that we really care about the issues. They're indicative that we're awake to the problem. And so we work with young people to really channel these feelings of eco-anxiety into agency, to become change makers, to use their individual skills and their sphere of influence, and their passion for whatever problem may ignite a fire in their tummy for really working collaboratively for the solutions. It's clear that we can't solve this crisis with the same thinking that went into it. If that were the case, then we would have solved it years ago. And so it's a case of really revolutionizing our way of thinking and digging deeper into the cultural underpinnings and of our society. So our mission of Force of Nature is working with young people to really kind of harness our individual skills to be a part of that solution.
And I love the phrase you have of helping everyone step up, not shut down. I think, in view of some of those things I read out earlier, we're all at risk of wanting to shut down. So I love that sense that you can harness it and turn it around, I guess. So thank you. Vib, so you're working with a big consultancy. So you are maybe working with the people who've come on from student, activism or student consciousness. How are you seeing that play out in what you do? Are you working with people already primed to make a difference?
It's really interesting. So alongside sort of EY, I also run a campaign on South Asian culture. And I say foremost, I'm an activist first, whether it's in EY, whether it's in South Asians for Sustainability. That is always the way I describe myself. And the way we're seeing business shift. I mean, there's a huge, from a regulation perspective, you're seeing that difference come up. And that is putting pressure, whether it's from investors, whether it's businesses themselves, whether it's colleagues, raising their voices and saying, actually, we want this on our sustainability agenda. You know, it's not unheard that particularly Gen Z millennials would rather work for companies that are practicing what they preach, companies that are, you know, they're more likely to choose to work for those. So you're seeing those different pressures coming through from a business angle as well. And from the grassroots level community engagement work that I do at South Asians for Sustainability and run, more and more now, as we've seen in COP27, climate justice is becoming at the forefront of every conversation. And the way that's translating from, you know, in businesses, in the way that comes through, more and more it's sort of human rights led, supply chain led at the moment. But I feel like the trajectory of everything is fundamentally in engaging communities where perhaps representation, like you touched on earlier, has not been present before. And I guess that's what really led me to start South Asians for Sustainability, is the lack thereof representation, people of colour within this sector, and the need for those voices to be in the room. I think that's fundamental to catalysing the change that's needed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, I imagine one of the driving forces on business will be not able to recruit the brightest and best if they don't have that kind of profile. Okay. Now, there's lots I want to ask you. I've realised, also on a tech level, I have no idea of the time because I haven't brought a timepiece. So Adam, would you sort of give me a signal when I should wrap up this part? I think we will have the video and then we're going to go to Caroline Lucas. So thank you. Yeah, rookie error. Okay, so one of the other things I wanted to, like to hear from all of you, your sort of top priority for change. I know this is a bit of a facile question because so many things need solving, but I'm just interested to know where you would, if you could wave a magic wand or get the Prime Minister or global leaders to do something, what would it be? But also your sense of where the impetus will come from now. When I started my career, it was all about influencing policy. We thought if we could get the regulation through, get the policy makers, that would sort of do the job, and then business and the sort of role of the citizen, was with certain groups. But certainly where I started, it was all about policy. So I'd be really interested to know where each of you think that impetus best comes from, maybe, or most likely to come from, or maybe it's all, but just your vision of who's going to pull the levers, if you like. Elle, let's start with you.
So it has to be said that I got into where I am now because I don't have much hope in the government. I have grown up under 12 years of Conservatives, and my MP back home has been in power since 1996 with 50% plus of the vote each time. And the only reason he wasn't in that seat before 96 is because before then it was called a different seat. It had a different name. And he was in for another 4 years before that as well, I believe. And so I have grown up and seen absolutely no change up until the point where young people started making a racket and started actually pushing to get their voices heard, because there aren't mechanisms for young people to have their voices heard. And that was what was really impactful about the kind of climate strike movement of 2019, just before COVID, is that it actually told young people that they didn't have to be silent, and that they didn't just have to wait until they finished education and got a job and hope that their job was sustainable and allowed them to do what they wanted, and then if not, vote for someone who might change it, because there was no chance of getting that politician out of his seat and getting him to listen even. And so about having a voice is really important, but how do you get people to have that voice? Well, something I read a few years ago which really impacted how I view kind of getting people to care is about the role of communities in this. And that they found, there was this research that found that one of the main reasons that people kind of got into climate denial and refused to believe that they could act was because they feared they would lose their community, because all of us are embedded in communities around us, be it around religion or education or just where we live. And these communities are really important to us and how we live. And yet, if you do something to change or disrupt that, there's a fear that you will lose that and you'll be isolated. And what's worse than being scared about the climate and the direction of the world, is feeling isolated in that. And so what's really important to actually making this change, I mean, there's all sorts that the government could and needs to do, but to actually make this change in our communities and in our villages, you have to act as a community and get people to care about just the little things around them, like the new housing development. While we need new housing in this area, they didn't even put a bike lane in for it. There isn't a bus stop. There's no way to actually get from this new development into the city where the jobs are unless you drive a car. And it's these little oversights that people actually really care about in their community. They just, unless you actually tell them, they get that it relates to the world around them, and that if you can get communities to make these changes, you have a community around making these positive changes to fight climate change. And that actually helps people to come to terms with what's happening and what needs to happen in the future.
But those must also have been emboldened by seeing, people on the street.
Yeah,
basically.
And it's something that's really helped
Which
with
we
me.
haven't seen for quite a long time. Again, back in the day.
Yeah.
There was that, but it was good to see it again.
But I think, so that was really important to a lot of young people, especially who are feeling disenfranchised with something that they hadn't even had the chance to be enfranchised into yet. And so I got into climate action because I was beginning to hear about climate change. It was just this thing in the back of my head that I came across on social media. And no one else in my classes cared. It wasn't really in the curriculum. It was never mentioned at school. And it felt like I was the only person in a class of 30 people in a year of 450 people who was paying attention. And I felt like I was so alone in that. And then when I started, and that was what led to these feelings of eco-anxiety, that I felt so tiny in compared to everything else. And then I started talking to other people from other schools who cared, who they were organising to go on marches and demonstrate. And actually you found that you had this whole community of other people who cared. And so for me to get where I was, it was reliant on that community of other young people who realised how disenfranchised we were, and who realised that actually there's enough of us here that we can have our voices heard and we can stand up for ourselves. And we found this community where we're not afraid to try and strive and make these changes because we know we're in it together. And that's what climate education will do. We have it in our education systems. It means that no child feels so isolated and alone when dealing with what the world is like.
That's so good to see, I have to tell you. Vibs, where do you think the force will come from? What do you want to change most, and where's that force going to come from?
I think personally for me, it always boils down to making sure that every community is involved. So climate justice is something that I'm personally very passionate about, and making sure that those voices are represented in the room, the communities that are facing the brunt of climate change right now, who are actually probably more active in coming up with solutions and dealing with the crisis today. We've got lots to learn and engage with them about. I think the impetus, it's a really interesting question, because often climate change is segregated from human rights, from the social side of ESG. And in my opinion, there's so much, everything works within the system, everything is interlinked, and segregating it from a business element, from a government level, it's not going to work unless there's collaboration amongst those systems, whether it's within a small business setup and they're looking at culture D&I separately to climate change and action within their net zero decarbonisation strategies. It's just not going to come together from a long-term perspective if it's not considered together. And I see that, for me, is where the impetus is within business, within banks, within wherever the community is. It's always finding those small things, that nuggets that people can connect with, and talking about this as the bigger picture that it is. It's not just an isolated climate change issue. It's not just human rights. It's everybody's collective action in what they care about the most, and everyone pulling together and making sure that that all works within the system.
Yeah, the system being the key,
Of course.
key thing. Yeah. Sophie, how does it look from your perspective?
Yeah, I'm in a complete agreement. I think there's so much focus on shifting the blame, whether it be government shifting the blame to business shifting the blame to putting that on the consumer, the individual. But ultimately, nobody is solely to blame for climate change, and it's instead of kind of focusing on shifting that guilt, it's about actually like refocusing, really changing that mindset and focusing on, well, what's my responsibility? How can I show up as a custodian for the earth and for nature and the world? Ultimately, it's so difficult to kind of focus on one priority when this is a complex system of so many different deeply rooted global injustices, and you can't extricate one from the other. And so as a young person, I don't think that burden should fall to my shoulders either, or any of our shoulders. These are systems that we've inherited, and we had no part in creating them, and yet we have to cope with the devastating feelings of, a terrifying future. So I love the previous points about community and finding solidarity, and we found that within the climate strikes. I personally found that within joining Force of Nature. Prior to working in Force of Nature, I was a door-to-door fundraiser for Greenpeace, and constantly talking about the problem and almost feeling like I was hitting a brick wall with members of the public that just seemed so apathetic. I really struggled with my mental health, and I began feeling that I was completely powerless. I kind of told myself this story that I didn't have any agency, and I was just, the system was already too broken. But by finding an incredible community of young change makers that are so passionate about solving this problem, it made me realize that I have skills that I can lend to solving this crisis, and we all do. It's about kind of that collective responsibility, and what kind of world we want to leave for future generations.
Yes, thank you. And we're here talking about environmental scientists. I think we have time for just one last reflection from each of you. How do you see the role of environmental scientists changing? Do you have any thoughts about that? So it's a bit of a big question to jump you.
So I think climate change currently is entirely, as a kind of item in the public conscience, is the understanding of it is entirely in the hands of the scientists, as the public sees, and that it's this big, scary concept that has all of this data that you get these graphs and these numbers in the news, and actually the public's data literacy isn't great, and that's something that we need to work on. And so people can't understand these figures that they're being shown, and it makes the science look really, really complicated and like this thing that they cannot access because they're just being shown these numbers and they don't know what they mean. And these numbers say really, really terrible things, so perhaps it's best they don't know what they mean. Mm-hmm. But people feel so disconnected from it. It's this really scientific issue currently. When in reality, we need to be talking to people about the solutions and listening to all of these different voices from different cultures and different communities who have all of these different ways of connecting with each other and with the environment that will bring about these solutions. And that actually the solutions we're asking people to implement aren't these scientific, we're not asking them to get into a lab and come up with the new material that's going to replace plastics. We're asking them to make these little changes at home and in the way we think about politics, and to make those changes and connect with their politicians, to lobby them and bring it into their businesses and their work, to divest and get funding sustainably. And so we need to stop we need to take it out of environmental scientists' hands when we come to talking about climate change with the general public especially, and that I think there's a role to be had where we need to actually stop thinking about it scientifically. And of course, this work needs to continue going behind the scenes, and we need to present these ideas to the public. But I don't think it's currently being done in a way that is actually understandable or useful to the public. It doesn't empower them to act. It's just yet another really complicated issue that is so beyond any individual than
well,
why act.
That's an important thing for us to take away and reflect on, for sure. Vibs, and then last word to Sophie.
So as you were talking, I was just trying to collate my thoughts. And I think language is a huge issue, or a barrier almost. And when we look at the diversity of our country globally, and when we talk about science reports and scientific knowledge as it's coming out more and more, there's a huge disconnect on a language perspective of how climate change is felt by different communities globally, but also within the UK. For example, a lot of what we do through the campaign at South Asians for Sustainability is breaking down climate science and sustainable behaviours in a way that is culturally relevant, so communities, so the average person in this country can understand, okay, if I want to take the first step, whether it's with consumption, the way that they buy, the way that they bank, the way anything with their pensions, where they work, there's an understanding from a cultural level, this is why I want to do this is why it's relevant to me. And I think there is that disconnect from a language element that if you were to say net zero to somebody, not everybody, well, most people wouldn't know unless they read up about it. And there's this risk of our work, becoming just this echo chamber where we as specialists and we're knowledgeable people, we know what it means, but it can just be we're continuing these events, we're continuing this, and we're just not crossing that barrier.
So again, crossing that
into the wider system and community. Yeah.
Sure, Sophie, the last word goes for you. We haven't had nearly long enough, but your final reflections.
Sure, yeah, I'd love to echo what's been said already. I think obviously there's this space, obviously the science is important, we've known the science for years, and it's clear that the way that we're messaging needs to change. But I think there's real opportunity for kind of cross collaboration as well, because there's a space, for artists to communicate the solutions in really creative means, and I think that's what really will enliven the public as well. But I think this is such an interesting question. And of course, in Nature, we've actually had the real privilege of working with climate scientists through an incredible partnership that we've had with the Natural History Museum. And through conversations that we've had with them, it's clear that scientists that have been talking about these issues for years, perhaps not communicating them in the most effective way, but that really care about the crisis, and they need space to come together and talk about their emotions as well, and how what they've witnessed really makes them feel. So we've been really privileged to hold that space for them, and I think there are some real incredible opportunities that come out of that for co-creation. Many of the scientists that we've worked with really want to engage with younger people more as well. So how can we kind of create those spaces and increase that knowledge sharing across sectors? I think it's something that we haven't quite harnessed yet.
Okay, thank you. And art so often the bridge between data and emotion, as you've said. Okay, well, as I say, we haven't had nearly long enough. Thank you for coming and giving some reflections in this forum, and I hope you find the rest of the evening interesting as well. I'm delighted to announce the beginning of our Future of Environmental Science 23 Horizon Scanning and Foresight project. We'll be using our platform to unite perspectives across the environment for collective horizon scanning on the future of the environmental sciences. I hope picking up some of the points we've heard tonight about how we can improve our public engagement and outreach. So by this time next year, the IES will have created a vision statement to support the sector to plan ahead, manage risk, and collectively secure a better future for the environment. It's an exciting piece of work, and I'm very optimistic that this will kick off the next 50 years of environmental science with the best possible vision for what we can achieve together, including that greater public engagement. So for tonight's lecture, just a short introduction before I welcome Caroline. I'm sure I don't need to remind everyone, the UK is in the grip of an energy crisis. Soaring energy bills are hitting households and businesses hard, having knock-on effects on the economy and resulting in a myriad of social problems. The war in Ukraine has brought energy security questions into sharp relief, and combined with the need for the UK to continue decarbonising, has resulted in the politics of energy supply being front and centre in public discourse. And it's against this background that this year's Burntwood speaker, Caroline Lucas, will look at the current energy situation and future pathways for energy production in the UK. In this 50th anniversary year of the IS, she'll also explore how influential the widening environmental community has been, and using case studies from the nuclear debate, shine a light on the role of science in informing and shaping policy. Short biography for Caroline. She was first elected as Member of Parliament for Brighton Pavilion in 2010. She was leader of the Green Party of England and Wales from 2008 to 2012 and co-leader from 2016 to 2018. Before that, for a decade prior to that, she served as one of the party's first members of the European Parliament and represented the South East region until becoming the UK's first Green MP. And as an MP, Caroline has served as chair and co-chair of many very important all-party parliamentary groups, including ones on climate change, limits to growth, fuel poverty, energy efficiency, democratic participation, and renewable and sustainable energy. So I don't think anyone is better qualified to talk to us tonight. Caroline, welcome. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much for such a generous introduction. I'll just deconstruct the podium here. And it's been great just to hear what's been said already this evening. I kind of feel that so much has already been covered. I could probably just do a quick 5 minutes and we could move on, but I won't. I will deliver my my part of the contract. But I just want to say how powerful it was to hear from Sophie, from Elle, from Vibs. And, you know, on the one hand, we can feel really excited that so many young people are so energized on this agenda. And yet what I really took away from what they said, in a sense, was just the toll that takes on young people, thinking about just how serious the crisis is that we face today. And, you know, young people should be being able to plan their futures and looking forward to the future with hope. And I think that is something that we really need to consider, that in terms of what the future feels like for so many young people, as we heard just tonight, I think is pretty terrifying. And that leads a lot of responsibility on all of us to try and get this right. So I am enormously honoured to have been asked to give this lecture. I know that I am in incredibly august company. And as well as marking the 50th anniversary of the Institution for Environmental Sciences, this year is also, as you know, the 50th anniversary of the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment, a conference which marked the first significant appearance of the environment as an issue on the global political agenda. And I think today, sometimes looking back, it's hard to imagine just how novel it was back then to consider that the activities of human beings could be threatening the very foundations of civilization. So I must admit to being somewhat daunted by the task I have tonight to assess how influential the environmental community has been over those 50 years, and to think about what that might mean for the future of energy in the United Kingdom. But it is, I think, a very appropriate theme for this lecture. And I imagine I'm not alone in wondering whether the Institution for Environmental Sciences will even be in a position to celebrate its 100th anniversary if our climate policy fails. Because it's becoming increasingly clear that if climate policy does fail, then it won't be possible to achieve any of those other environmental goals that were set down together for the first time in Stockholm 50 years ago. So in one way, it's quite simple. Climate policy simply requires the world as a whole to stop burning fossil fuels as fast as possible, certainly within the next 3 decades, and hopefully a lot sooner than that. And that means that we need to find alternative ways to meet the energy needs of the 8 billion of us sustained by this life-giving planet, whilst at the same time delivering equality and a decent standard of living for all. And that's why our energy policies are the most important and urgent component of our response to the climate crisis. Our increasingly urbanized global civilization can't survive without secure access to affordable energy services, but nor can it survive the impact of a relentlessly heating climate on prosperity and security. They succeed together or they fail together. And this is a challenge to humanity that is quite literally without historical precedent. We not only have to achieve a total transformation of our energy system, but we have to do it within a very specific and limited time frame. And in the wake of the disappointing outcome of the latest round of climate negotiations in Egypt, it can be tempting to wonder whether the problem is just too great, the time too short, and human beings too divided and distracted for success to be possible. It is very possible to lose hope. What I'd like to do this evening is to reflect, as you asked, on the growth of the widening environmental community in Britain and to examine the extent to which that does indeed provide us with grounds for hope, active hope that we actually need to act on, not just sit on our sofas clutching it like a lottery ticket, but really using that hope to drive us forward to meet the undeniable challenges that we face today. And I want to draw some lessons on the part it could and should play in developing a vision and pathways towards an energy future that is compatible with a livable climate. Now, reading recent headlines, you could be forgiven for perhaps thinking that the environmental community in Britain comprises a small group of activists determined to disrupt traffic and redecorate paintings. I'd suggest that actually tells us rather more about the declining quality of editorial judgment in Britain's media, especially in the increasingly intolerant right-leaning newspapers, than it does about the environmental movement in Britain. Personally, I have considerable sympathy for the frustration that motivates people, and by no means only young people, to join Extinction Rebellion or Just Stop Oil. They are quite right to expose our consistent failure to deliver the changes needed to keep their climate safe and their futures viable. And frankly, if ministers go ahead and give the green light to the first new coal mine in this country in 30 years later this week, I think their grounds for disillusionment and anger could not be better placed. They are also right to say that the disruption that they create is insignificant compared to that which is already being created by a changing climate in some parts of the world, and which will certainly be an ever more present reality here at home if climate policy fails, as I would argue it is currently doing. Their activities are, as they intended them to be, a powerful reminder that all the efforts of the world's governments over the past 40 years, efforts in which the British government has a legitimate claim to have played a leading part, they have not done anything like enough to rise to the challenges we face. So they are right to point to the yawning gap between ambition and achievement, between the urgency required and the desultory pace of action, between the implacable logic of carbon physics and the seemingly infinitely elastic ambiguity of political commitments. Now, there is a venerable tradition of non-violent direct action in Britain, which has played a critical part in driving forward social and political change, not least for women. But protest, of course, is only one part of a much more multifaceted tradition of British environmentalism, the full scope of which is often obscured by what makes a sensational headline. And it's a tradition of which this institution and its fellow member bodies of the Society for the Environment are an integral part. Now, this is not the occasion for a detailed account of the environmental community in Britain. So this evening, I will focus on just 3 of the many pillars of that community. And in compressing such a long and vibrant history into a few short paragraphs, I will inevitably miss out much that is important, and I hope you'll forgive me for those omissions. But the 3 pillars I have in mind are the environmental professionals, and then the nature conservation bodies and campaigning environmental NGOs, and then, if you'll allow me, the Green Party itself. And I sometimes feel that we are all so focused on our own immediate priorities, we can forget our wider community and lose sight of the fact that we all have many allies, and that together we have become such a powerful collective force for the environment. But I also have to admit that I sometimes feel that we are nothing like as good at punching our weight politically as we are at delivering those incremental day-to-day changes that help to improve life for British people on a daily basis, but which too often actually fail to address the underlying drivers of environmental destruction. So let me start by looking at what is, in some ways, the oldest and most overlooked of those 3 pillars, the environmental professionals, many of you in this room tonight. The foundations date back at least as far as the Industrial Revolution, as the scientists and administrators began to understand and grapple with the environmental consequences of industrialization. Then, as now, human health was one of the most powerful drivers of political responses to environmental problems. The Public Health Act of 1848, the Smoke Nuisances Act in 1853, the Alkali Act of 1863, together laid the foundations of today's environmental law. And that body of law has now grown to occupy no fewer than 1,300 pages in 2 volumes of Halsborough's Laws of England. The 24-member bodies of the Society for the Environment, of which this institution is one, represent some 400,000 environmental professionals who play a central role in making that law work. As do the environmental lawyers, the green finance professionals, for whom I couldn't find a total number, but who also make up a core element of Britain's globally competitive professional services industry. Furthermore, these environmental professionals are simply the spearhead of a far wider network of operational personnel who deliver the outcomes environmental law requires, from running recycling plants or insulating homes, to monitoring pollution indicators or restoring degraded habitats. I thought it was interesting that our national statistics don't seem to have a category for people employed in protecting the environment. A recent Institute of Employment Studies report estimated that there were 250,000 environmental jobs in London alone, of which some 50,000 were environmental professionals. So if that pattern were repeated across the country as a whole, we would be looking at about the same number of people employed in environmental protection as are currently employed in manufacturing, making a contribution to the economy that rarely attracts as much political attention. Now, much of that present body of environmental law that underpins this significant part of our movement and of the economy indeed, has been shaped by membership of the European Union. Indeed, in the smoke and mirrors around the Brexit debate, the extent to which EU environmental law was actually shaped by Britain's environmental priorities and policies was often overlooked. And frankly, that makes the cavalier approach of our government to what would effectively be the abandonment of EU environmental legislation that's contained in the retained EU law bill particularly unforgivable. That bill would not only lead to a collapse of most of our environmental standards, it would also undermine an increasingly important part of our economy and create massive job losses. So it's not enough for the government to delay or remove the entirely arbitrary deadline by which any EU environmental legislation not specifically amended would simply be annulled, a recipe for a level of regulatory chaos that it would be hard to exaggerate. This legislation is, as the government's own Regulatory and Policy Committee reported, simply not fit for purpose. And I have to say, a government policy that is able to compel both the CBI and the TUC to write a joint letter of opposition to it must be particularly perverse, but this bill has indeed managed that rare distinction. and it should quite simply be scrapped in its entirety. Moving on to the second pillar of Britain's environmental community, and that is the flourishing and constantly evolving ecology of voluntary organisations, nature conservation bodies, and environmental campaigning NGOs. And it turned out to be more difficult than I imagined to find out the full strength of this particular pillar. Google produced estimates that ranged from 684 organisations to 1,750. So I think we can say with confidence that there are literally hundreds of voluntary bodies in Britain working to protect the environment. And that shouldn't really come as a surprise to anyone. There is a very deep, wide and profound tradition of voluntary action in Britain across a vast range of social and political issues, as well as the environment. Over 16 million people a year volunteer with one of the 17,000 charities that make up the membership of the NCVO, for example. One of the formal documents submitted by the British government to that Stockholm conference in 1972 was titled 50 Million Volunteers, to celebrate the role of voluntary action in protecting Britain's environment. And this living tradition too can also trace its origins back to the 19th century. It began with the natural scientists who laid the foundations of the modern nature conservation organisations. William Morris was an early leader, founding the Commons and Open Spaces Society in 1865. The RSPB joined in 1898, shortly after Octavia Hill founded the National Trust in 1895. In 1912, Charles Rothschild laid the foundations of an organisation that grew to be the Wildlife Trusts, with its 2,300 nature reserves and nearly 1 million members. The Worldwide Fund was founded in Britain. The World Wildlife Fund, I should say, was founded in Britain in 1961, followed by Plant Life, Bug Life, and a host of other bodies to form an increasingly influential ecosystem. The nature conservation organisations were joined in the 1970s by a second generation of environmentalists. And if the first generation had as their impelling force the preservation of something for its intrinsic or aesthetic value, the next cohort had a more pragmatic and more urgent focus. Rather than a primary mission to protect natural sites directly, these organisations set their sights on changing legislation and public policy. And these are the campaigners we've already heard about tonight: the Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, Green Alliance, Surfers Against Sewage, and an army of other local and national bodies. They were and still are driven by the goals of securing a healthy environment for people and preserving the natural resource base of the economy. And by the beginning of the 1990s, I think these two strands had combined and grown into an increasingly prominent force for the environment. It would take another whole lecture, at least as long as this one, to do justice to what these true traditions of voluntary environmentalism have accomplished over the past 50 years. There have inevitably been victories and defeats along the way. But beyond a doubt, despite the manifest failings of successive governments, this country's environment is in a far, far better state than it would otherwise have been without their efforts. That said, I doubt that anyone in any part of this movement feels ready to say, mission accomplished. The overriding achievement, I think, has been to consistently bring alive and amplify the messages from environmental science, to engage the public, and to harness both of those to actively influence policymakers. They've given very powerful voice to a deeply felt commitment by the British public to protecting our environment, one that is often under-recognised by editors and political leaders alike. I've mentioned that joint letter between the TUC and the CBI, for example. Also, the 8 million members of the 10 largest bodies alone make up 13% of the population of Britain. The RSPB on its own has more members than all of Britain's political parties put together. So you'll appreciate perhaps why, when I listen to Jacob Rees-Mogg, whose party has a mere 170,000 members on a good day, talk about public opinion in the environment, I do wonder how much he actually knows about it. And you'll also appreciate, I hope, and not just out of self-interest, why I thought it was important just to spend a few moments talking about the place my own party occupies in the environment community, the third pillar that I'll just reference tonight. Because I'd argue that Parliament is where the legitimate voice of the British people speaks. No matter how strong voices are outside of Parliament, nor how loud the clamour in the headlines, nor how fundamental the issue, Parliament is uniquely placed to hold a government to account for its failures. Parliament is uniquely placed to force a government to act. And despite the clear desire of Britain's citizens for more effective and urgent action on the environment, the reality is that successive governments have failed the British people and the environment. They have never been properly held to account for that failure. We've had avalanches of warm words, burying frozen budgets and weakened agencies. We've had trenchant green headlines obscuring minuscule green progress. And it's not because we've lacked the technology to do better on the environment. Far from it, we are an inventive and creative people, nor have we lacked the economic means to do better. We are the 6th richest economy in the world. And why would you ever imagine that eliminating the relentless waste that does so much environmental damage would do anything other than improve the notoriously poor productivity of our economy? The reality is that what we've lacked is simply the political will to use the power of the state effectively to protect and enhance the natural resource foundations of the economy, to improve the quality of life for Britain's citizens, and liberate that creativity and ingenuity to build the greener economy that the future requires. And I think that failure is increasingly being recognised by British people who, despite all the barriers imposed by our archaic voting system, do continue to vote for the Green Party and get more of them representatives elected to office in Britain. In Scotland, for example, there are now 2 Green ministers in the Scottish Government, 7 members of the Scottish Parliament, as well as Green councillors in 13 of the 32 councils in Scotland. In England and Wales, there are 559 elected Green Party councillors on 170 local councils. And the leaders of Brighton and Hove City Council, Lancaster City and Stroud Town are from the Green Party, and we have a rotating leader and deputy in Lewis. Put simply, the case I want to make tonight is that we are the political manifestation of the environment movement. So turning now to the lessons the environmental community has learned in the 50 years since this institution was founded, and you will be relieved that I won't even attempt to document all of them, otherwise it would indeed be a very long night. Unfortunately, many of them are very well recorded in a brilliant publication that I would commend to you by the British Academy. It was published just a few months ago, conveniently titled Lessons from the History of UK Environment Policy. But I do want to draw just a few lessons from the past 50 years of green history. And first is that we need more voices for the environment in Parliament. And of course, I would prefer them to be Green Party members, but what matters most is that there are more voices speaking meaningfully and consistently for the environment in every political party. And the competitive nature of electoral politics is such that the more Green Party elected members there are, the more the other parties will have to raise their own environmental game. But leaving aside my own party's interest, the lesson that I want to communicate, especially to younger voters, is the importance of voting, that it really does matter. The environmentally reactionary voices in the other parties, and there are some in all of them, currently rely on the fact that younger voters who care most about the environment tend to vote less. And the difference that it can make was clearly illustrated in the recent US elections, where the much anticipated Republican sweep was actually blunted by a much higher turnout than usual from younger voters. So the lesson for me is that as a community, we should encourage everyone, but younger voters in particular, to vote whenever they have the opportunity and to vote above all for the candidates they think will be most ambitious and keep their promises on the environment. I have to add that having listened to Elle talking about their experience locally, I would add to that actually what we need to do is to be campaigning for a fairer voting system, because for as long as we have a voting system that essentially means that many MPs have safe seats and don't actually have to respond to their constituents, it's harder to make that case for the importance of voting. So let's add in that the environmental community, I think, ought to be joining forces to the very many other organisations out there who are campaigning right now for fair votes. The second lesson I think we should draw from the impact made over the past 5 decades is this. that we need to expect the same ambition of ourselves as we expect of others when it comes to protecting our environment. It's time to be clear that no matter how much positive action is taken, no matter how much investment in alternatives and renewables, the climate still demands an end to the burning of fossil fuels. That is the bottom line. Fossil fuels have to remain in the ground. And crucially, it's beyond time to be bold enough to join up the dots between our destructive, growth-obsessed economic model and the destruction of our natural world. Because this year marks the 50th anniversary of another report, the anniversary of the publication of Limits to Growth. It is genuinely hard to overestimate the huge impact that report had right across society. It put the idea of environmental limits on the map. It put the possibility of continual exponential growth under the spotlight. It was quoted and misquoted by politicians, policymakers, and presidents. It sold 30 million copies in 30 different languages worldwide. Now, at the time, mainstream economists and politicians lined up in droves to refute its findings, largely because they disliked the implications. But the broad consensus of scientific opinion today, even as recently as a report from a KPMG director, Gaia Harrington, last year, is that the predictions of the original report are still pretty much on track. And today I would argue that it is clearer than ever that when prosperity is cashed out in terms of economic growth and progress is given over to the never-ending pursuit of profit alone, society itself becomes dysfunctional. Fairy tales of eternal economic growth, as Greta Thunberg famously called them, have devastated the planet, destabilized the economy, and undermined social stability. And we see the impacts of those fairy tales almost every day. In the past few months, we've seen apocalyptic impacts of the climate emergency in Pakistan. We've learnt that irreversible climate tipping points may be a lot closer than we thought. And we've witnessed the devastating consequences of a system dependent on fossil fuels for the lives and livelihoods of ordinary people. Earlier this year, half a century after the publication of the original report, the Club of Rome produced a new report, Earth for All. Like its predecessor, it's a call to arms, building on calls for systems change and popular movements like Fridays for Future and People Not Profit. And its aim was not just to diagnose the problems, but to set out what we need to do to turn things around. And systems thinking is absolutely central to that. And so to the third lesson, it's time to set our wider collective sights well beyond awareness raising. Environmental events are themselves driving the politics of the environment in the public mind. For many, possibly most people in this country, what environmentalists have foreseen for decades is now part of their daily experience. And this is particularly true of climate change, but it's also the case whether we're talking about the quality of the air we breathe, or the state of the waters we swim in, or the silence of the bees that we sadly no longer hear buzzing. This means that it is increasingly important that as a community, we sound to most people like we care as much about what they care about as we do about what we care about. And I think there are occasional times when our arguments, possibly because of the passion with which we make them, can sound tin-eared to people struggling with low pay, high rents, and high inflation. And this adds to the false impression, dear to a small number of out-of-touch but influential editors and the columnists that they employ, that somehow only a privileged elite care about the environment. And nowhere is it more important to speak the language of people up and down the country that when it comes to setting out energy policy for Britain, an energy policy that will deliver both for climate and for the economy, for the environment and for people and businesses. Now, the firmest basis of Britain's claim to global climate leadership is the existence of the Climate Change Act, itself a result primarily of effective campaigning by Friends of the Earth. That act makes it a legal requirement for Britain to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Now, to meet that target, the current government has pledged to decarbonise our electricity system by 2035. Labour has recently promised to do it by 2030. Now, decarbonising electricity first is particularly important because it's not only central to decarbonising transport, but also because it buys us the time we need to decarbonise our grossly energy efficient building stock, as well as the carbon emissions from our food and agriculture system. Getting to net zero by 2035 or sooner means replacing the gas we currently use with carbon-free sources of electricity. Now, Britain has just under 80 gigawatts of generational capacity installed. Currently, peak demand doesn't go above some 55 gigawatts, and for long periods in the year, demand falls at night to below 30 gigawatts. And because demand and supply must always be in balance, that means we switch off a lot of this capacity for very long periods. And in turn, that means that very expensive equipment sits unused, earning no revenues for long periods of time. Thus, the need to decarbonise our electricity system is also a huge opportunity to improve its economic efficiency, to realise the potential of taking full advantage of the increased ability to match supply and demand for electricity efficiently provided by renewables and by modern informatics. Now, since achieving net zero by 2050 requires a greater dependence on electricity to meet our need for energy, improving the overall economic efficiency of our electricity system will benefit both householders and the economy by reducing bills. And to take full advantage of those opportunities, however, we should first deal with the extraordinary burden placed on public health, on people's personal finances, and on the climate by the continued failure to remedy the most energy wasteful housing stock in the whole of Europe. Warm homes should be a given. And doing that properly would not only reduce the amount of extra carbon-free electricity we need to produce by 2050, perhaps by as much as half, it would also reduce consumer bills by several £100s a year. So meeting that 2035 target, or indeed an earlier one, for carbon-free electricity is perfectly possible if we focus our investment efforts on clear priorities. The government's approach right now, I would argue, is not doing that. It is to try a bit of everything, which may please the energy lobbyists, but is more likely to mean that we don't do enough of what's actually necessary. And you in this room know what's actually necessary. We need to concentrate on deploying offshore and onshore wind rapidly and supporting this with further investment in solar, especially incentivizing things like using the acres of roofs of retail shipment facilities, as well as challenging the idea that it's impossible to have both agriculture and ground source solar at the same time. I would argue that it is entirely possible, and indeed in whole swathes of East Anglia they are doing it. Renewable energy costs are continuing to fall, and as the IEA has pointed out, they are now cheaper than new fossil fuel generation in every corner of the world. Indeed, there was just a new announcement by the IEA today saying that there has been the largest ever upward revision in their forecast about the amount of renewables coming online over the next few years. It's now 76% higher than it was 2 years ago in terms of their forecast of the amount of renewables coming onto the grid. It's necessary too, of course, to invest in electricity storage to ensure the security of supply required by the variability of renewable generation. That means investing in batteries, whose costs are also falling rapidly for short duration storage, and in green hydrogen for long duration storage. We currently pay through the nose for wind generators to turn off their supply when demand is low. It would make much more economic sense to use that electricity to make green hydrogen that we can store to use during those spells when we have low wind power. Now, you may well have noticed that I have not so far mentioned any part for further nuclear power in this path to net zero. And that is quite simply because despite the government's obsession with a mega programme of large and small reactors, I believe there really isn't one. And I say this not only because of a wealth of environmental proliferation and economic reasons why I and so many others have long been opposed to nuclear power, but also because, on the government's own analysis, it has no role in a credible, resilient energy future. The government has recently reiterated its commitment to going ahead with a new nuclear power station at Sizewell in Suffolk in order, it says, to meet its 2035 target for decarbonising electricity. I have to conclude that it simply hasn't read its own impact statement on this decision. If it had, it would have found that the expected time between a final investment decision on Sizewell C and the supply of the first electricity would be between 13 and 17 years. You don't have to be a genius at mathematics to add 13 years to 2023 and get 2036. So even if everything went according to plan, which it has never done in history for an EDF reactor of this type, investing in Sizewell cannot possibly contribute to meeting the 2035 decarbonisation target. That means that to meet the target, the government must find other ways to ensure that secure and affordable carbon-free electricity is available to consumers by 2035. And as it happens, as I've just outlined, those other ways are available, plentiful, and frankly blow nuclear out of the water economically. Indeed, not even EDF is arguing that it can supply electricity cheaper than renewables can. Now, it's at this point that promoters of further nuclear power start to mutter about baseload, which is a concept I have found few of them can readily explain. I note that it's a word you hear often from politicians and journalists, but not so much from electricity industry experts, possibly because it is fully a decade since Stephen Holliday, then the CEO of National Grid, himself called it a redundant concept. Baseload doesn't refer to any electricity system values or services, and it's not equivalent to reliability. Historically, it's functioned as shorthand for a category of resources, essentially coal and nuclear, that provided relatively low operating cost electricity to meet minimum around-the-clock electricity demand levels. But at a time when renewables are far more competitive than they were, and when they come in at a zero marginal cost, and when flexibility is the thing that is now at a premium, it no longer makes sense to default to inflexible coal and nuclear, which can't be quickly ramped up and down to serve the bulk of load. Rather, a mix of resources, including renewables, but also storage, smart grids, demand management, along with residual gas, can contribute dynamically to a reliable and cost-effective system. Moreover, I have to say that the government has nowhere set out the business case for any investment in Sizewell C, or indeed any of the other nuclear chimeras being noisily touted by the nuclear industry. I think we need to get the government to set out that financial case publicly, so that it can be compared openly and transparently to the business case from the renewables industry, and then we will find out who is going to offer the quickest, cheapest, and more scalable way to get to decarbonising electricity by 2035 or sooner. And I am pretty sure that we can conclude that it will not be nuclear. So in conclusion, I have set out the arguments on energy at some length for two reasons. Firstly, to illustrate what I mean by needing to raise our sights and ambition and offer a more articulate challenge to the government for its failures on the environment. And second, to reflect that the changes this moment demands encompass so much. It's not just energy alone, it's the economy, it's nature, it's equality, it's people's well-being. In short, what we need is that systems change. And if our community can unite behind that recognition and really focus on it, that would be a strength of superhero proportions, especially if the environmental community is prepared to wield it with conviction. It's hugely welcome to see campaigns such as Warm This Winter making those connections, and it's always been a fundamental part of the Green Party philosophy and approach as well. But our whole community needs to raise a united voice on the urgency of systems change. If we stay in the environment-only box and keep it to the well-trodden paths of the last 50 years, I fear we will spend the next 50 regretting it. I spoke earlier about the temptation to lose hope. No matter how bleak things can sometimes feel, I draw enormous hope from what we have already achieved together so far. My greatest hope now is that we can use the ever-dwindling window of time that remains as wisely as possible and write both a positive future and many decades more of our shared history. Thank you.
A personal reflection, I sometimes think this obsession with big kit is for somebody just to cut a ribbon.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. Thank you. So we have some Q&A, if you're happy.
Sure.
So we have an audience online as well. Good evening to our audience online. So you can ask questions through Slido. Just go to slido.com and join as participant, and you need a code, which I don't know if we have up, but I'll read it out, 728-944. So slido.com/728-944, and you can ask questions via that. For those of you in the room, we have roving mics. While you're thinking about your questions, I'm going to take chair's privilege, the first one, Caroline, if I may. What will it take for science to get over to politics that there are limits to growth?
Well, I was pondering on that question a little bit when you were asking that of Els and Sophie and the others. And I think my experience of dealing with scientists in my role as an MP hasn't actually been a particularly happy one. I sit on the Environmental Audit Committee, and from time to time, we have scientists who will come in to brief us before we do a particular inquiry. And if I can lay down a bit of a challenge tonight, it feels quite often that scientists are self-censoring what they believe is politically acceptable to say. And that makes the job of politicians who do want to push this agenda incredibly difficult, because if you've got in front of the other politicians from the other parties, scientists who appear to be saying that things aren't really that bad and that, 2050 is fine and we don't need to do anything any sooner. And, it is just deeply troubling. So I do get that, of course, the scientific community can't ever be party political and it needs to maintain its credibility. But at the same time, I hope, and it is beginning to happen more. I mean, there are more joint letters now between different groups of scientists, which I think is really helpful. But that way in which quite often it feels as if what's being told is what is politically possible in people's minds rather than what's scientifically necessary, I think is quite challenging. So to answer your question, I mean, telling the truth would be great.
Okay, that's
not that I'm suggesting people aren't.
Certainly,
you know what
a
I mean?
message
Saying
for
it
us
as it needs to be
ponder.
said.
Okay, questions in the room. Mark, I've seen one there and one there, first of all.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you very much for that. That was great. One of the huge challenges, as I see it, is persuading the world of politics to appreciate, to embrace the plurality of values of nature. Like you, I read the latest ONS report. Something like 92% of the values are provisioning cultural services. In other words, consumables. I think 8% were regulating. I left the figures at home. I forgot to bring them. But essentially, the ONS report is about how nature serves business as usual economics, not how the multiplicity of values of nature are the absolute underpinnings of all policy areas. So how do we shift that in political thinking about the wealth of values of nature, not just the utilitarian values?
I think that's a really good question, and it is particularly when so many solutions that get put forward in a kind of market-oriented economy are all about putting a price on nature and then trading it off, whether we're talking about biodiversity offsets or, net gain and so on. And I do worry that there is a fundamental logic that goes along with that kind of approach, which means that if you're not careful, then the value is only the price tag you put on it. I mean, how you do the opposite, the thing is that we've seen how it's been done really beautifully by Partha Dasgupta, for example, in that amazing report. And he talked about the limits to just putting price tags on things. And so the difficulty, in a sense, in trying to answer your question is not that there isn't the analysis out there, sometimes very beautifully expressed in big reports and so forth. It's about how you actually get, frankly, politicians from a particular political ideology to recognise something that is slightly less familiar to them and falls outside that particular mindset. We probably need a few of them on the platform to answer your question better, but I think we need to do more than just revert back to finding, for example, there was the famous example. It was lovely to see Joan Whalley, actually, who was a former chair of the Environmental Audit Committee. And I remember at a time when she was chairing the meeting, we had a big inquiry on bees and the future of bees. And we had all those figures about if the bees weren't doing the pollination, how much it would cost for people on ladders to go up and do the pollination by hand. And that argument is important, but I just worry that it reinforces a mindset that comes back to putting those financial costs.
Everything has a price.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take a couple of questions together maybe, so that, no, I've already had one, the gentleman in the second row, the gentleman here, and then next to you, and then just behind, and one at the back.
Sorry.
So you'll have to be brief and crisp and brief. I'll take two at a time.
Okay, I'll try. Roger Bartley for IAQM. The solution to environmental problems often lies in a combination of the collective action of individuals and leadership by government through policy and regulation. I wonder where you think the balance lies for UK energy use, and perhaps as an example we can consider the domestic fuel use, where I as an individual can make very, very positive choices, but arguably there are financial and practical constraints to implementing some of those.
I mean, I'm supporting the Community Energy Bill in Parliament, which would, I think, transform the energy picture and would enable people, for example, who might have solar panels on their roofs to sell to their neighbours without needing a middle person, so that you could actually genuinely unleash the amount of creativity and interest in trying to do some of this stuff by getting off the back of people national policy that isn't helpful. I'm a chair of the all-party parliamentary group on the Green New Deal, and we've just been doing an inquiry, speaking to lots of different council leaders about what are the challenges and obstacles at a national level that stop local level flourishing, whether that's in energy or transport or food. And again, it's about more powers being given to local authorities and to local regions so that exactly people can play much more of a part themselves in building this greener future. If a greener future is imposed on people, if it's done to people, then it's not surprising, it's not very attractive, and people will understandably kick back. That is human nature. Whereas, if they could see that they have a part to play in terms of the local energy generation, for example, or by having a real stake in the local, whatever the local community energy project is, then that makes it so much more meaningful. So to me, I think some radical devolution needs to go alongside this whole agenda so that we enable action to be taken much more locally, because we won't get to net zero just by national government. National government needs to set that policy framework, the enabling policy framework, but it is at a local level, local authorities, local councils, doing things like Andy Burnham is able to do as a Metro Mayor in Manchester. He can take back control of the buses and transform transport, which you can't do in most other places in this country because we're not allowed to do that. So we need to get away from government having such a stranglehold on what we can do, whether that's in energy or transport or food.
Okay, thank you. Right, two questions in the front row here, this gentleman and then the gentleman next to you.
Are there some women?
Yeah, I think there might be one at the back in a minute, but yes.
Where are we going first, Julie?
I'm going in order. This gentleman here.
Thank you, Caroline, for a stimulating lecture. I think talking about radioactive and renewables, I think the push for nuclear is political, and it's based on keeping the military and the possibility for weaponry going. I think that's one of them. I think the way we should be going is to solar and wind. It's the only way, and we have to keep away from. We don't need nuclear. And on the internet, Greenpeace has made a really good article on using farming and solar together.
Yeah, I think Caroline's in full agreement with it, and as luck would have it, we have someone from Greenpeace right next to you.
Yeah, that is a good article if anybody wants to read it. It's Doug Parr from Greenpeace. Thank you, Caroline, for all those reflections with which I fully concur. And as a kind of foot soldier of the organisations of how many 13 million members it is, who have been trying for a long time to get environment, climate more central to the way of political thinking. I look at the time that I've spent doing this, which is 3 decades or so, and I feel like Have we really punched our weight? I kind of think no. So it's not for want of trying, it's not for want of effort, it's not for want of people working long hours, thinking up creative tactics, using brilliant ideas to try and get stuff, erected somewhere illegally, or, doing clever things on social media, or pressuring MPs or whatever. And yet, it doesn't happen. Why do you think that is?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for everything that you do. I think there are a number of reasons. I think, notwithstanding the fact that in recent weeks and months, a campaign has come together, Warm This Winter, which has united lots of the environment groups. In my experience, it is a very fragmented sector, and part of that is because each group depends upon their fundraising, and that means that sometimes there is in competition with one another rather than working collaboratively alongside them. And sometimes I think it leads to targets being selected. I'm not meaning by Greenpeace by any means, but by some groups, targets get selected because they are winnable, even though incrementally they're not actually that significant. But in order to be able to write to your donors and your members to say, hurrah, we've achieved X, without necessarily wondering whether or not X is the most important thing to be achieving right now. So to me, it's partly about joining up the environment movement. I think it's about pushing the boundaries, and I know Greenpeace does this par excellence, but pushing the boundaries of what is allowed under the new bill. What was it called? The Lobbying and Transparency Bill, which has had this freezing effect on what NGOs can do. And I know NGOs are doing fantastic things. You're taking the government to court regularly, and thank God you're doing that. But I kind of want even more of that. I just think if 8% of the British population are members of these environmental groups, then there's a power there that's not being used and could be used much more effectively. I would like to see, for example, a way in which those organisations could be campaigning for electoral reform. Now, people will clutch their pearls and say we can't do that. It's not in our charter of whatever. But unless we get a decent voting system, why is Britain so far behind in so many ways than, say, Germany? It's partly because we have a fairer voting system.
That has to be part of the answer.
It's got to be part of the answer.
Absolutely.
And, I know it sounds like special pleading, but there is a correlation between those countries that have more Greens in Parliament and better, stronger environmental regulation. And I would love some of the environment NGOs to be a bit more courageous when it came to that too.
Okay, right. There's a woman in the back. Can we go to, please? And one here.
Thank you, Caroline. Undoubtedly, the energy crisis will continue for years to come, and our government, UK government, has to consider a transition to an energy mix that reduces the use of coal and fossil fuel to renewable and greener energy. However, such energy mix will take years to happen. Two main sources, which you mentioned, Caroline, green hydrogen and the nuclear. I had the opportunity to be part of the environmental impact assessment team and visit the sites we'll see this year, which took about 4 days. And I found the visit very interesting. My question, if the government insists to, if we go through the nuclear as a source of clean energy, my question, what would be the role of environmentalists and NGOs in UK to ensure that future nuclear plants will have minimum environmental and social impact on local community and biodiversity in UK? Thank you.
I think if the environmental community has to be worrying about what to do once it's been built, then we've completely, we've lost it. It's going to, it'll be built by what, 2035, 36, as I was saying, at the very earliest. That gives us a good number of years to try and stop it being built. I have some sympathy, I must say, with the comment at the front here, that, in terms of trying to work out intellectually why would the government want to be promoting nuclear power, given all of the arguments against it economically and in terms of safety and in terms of so much else. And actually the only answer I can come to is, in fact, there is that correlation between the skills within the nuclear industry, nuclear power industry, and nuclear weapons. And the University of Sussex has done some excellent work, Peter Newell and others, looking at exactly that correlation. But to answer your question, you know, you called it clean energy. Nuclear energy is not clean. You know, okay, so it doesn't in itself come out with that much CO2 once it's running, but there's plenty of CO2 when you're actually setting the thing up. And anybody who can think that radioactive waste is in any way clean that's problematic. We also knew that when we looked at the risks of terrorism, the planes that went into the Twin Towers, one of them was actually potentially, another one that came down before it hit, thankfully, was potentially on the way to a nuclear power station. You know, these are ticking time bombs. We do not need them in any shape or form. We need to just go out there and chain ourselves to the diggers, all of us, see you there, and then we won't need to worry what to do by the time they're built, because they won't be.
Question second row here, please.
Hi. Thank you, Caroline. It was a real pleasure to hear you speak on this topic. My name is Roisin. I'm an environmental consultant with WSP. And I work on a lot of these types of projects all over the world. And some of them are green projects, some of them are not. But my question is quite a large question. Certainly we have a lot to do in the UK, but we really are ahead, I would say. When I visit family abroad or in Lebanon, the idea of net zero to them is a joke. Like, hydrocarbons are a salvation to their economy. So how do we use our knowledge and our movement that we have on policy and our desire to change things here to help, because it's a worldwide problem and we are so very small in a global scale. And how do we influence our companies and our people to go out and make that change beyond our shores?
Yeah. There are some UK things we should be proud of.
Yeah, there are indeed.
How do we spread that?
And the environmental professionals are certainly a sector of whom we should be very proud. And you will know better than I do. I'm sure there must be all kinds of ways in which there is a cross-fertilization of ideas and shared practice and, you know, just learning from best practice. And I'm sure that must be happening all the time. The only point I would just come back to, and I'm sorry to you know, because that's very positive and I'm about to be negative again, so I apologize, but at the end of the day, it's not what we say, it's what we do. And I'm just so enraged by the idea that it looks as if the government is going to give the green light to the first new coal-fired power station in 30 years. This is the same government that in Glasgow was talking about powering down coal, was talking about how they were going to lead this new coalition to a bright new future. If all of the wonderful work that people like yourselves are doing are undermined by a government that is completely ignoring all the evidence and going back to doing something that isn't even being wanted by the steel industry, then I think the credibility of all of the fantastic work that you're doing is massively undermined. So I mean, I'm sure you're doing all of that fantastic work and keep doing it, but and meanwhile, let's get more of us trying to stop the government undermining it at every turn.
Okay, question here, please. To keep Joseph on his feet.
Hello, thank you, Ian Byrne. Are electric vehicles part of the solution, or are they likely just to be another systemic error?
Well,
good question.
if the vision is that we simply replace every petrol-driven car by an electric vehicle, then that is definitely a systems failure and a step in the wrong direction and a nightmare, not least because, as we all know, there's so much else energy-wise and resources-wise and minerals that go into building cars, whether they're powered by electricity or petrol or diesel. Of course, there are going to be, in the future, a need for some number of cars, and I hope that most of those would be car shares or ones that you can use when you don't, you know, when you need it, and that mass transit would be far better advanced. I worry that at the moment it's being seen as the be all and end all, you know, so the whole debate about green transport tends to end with how many electricity charging points that you have for EVs, rather than are you going to make buses free for people and how do you make sure that they actually connect with the trains and, you know, really radical things like that. So I think they have a small part to play, but I worry that the debate over that is massively crowding out what would make a much, much bigger difference and which is much more necessary for people.
Sure. I think we have a question from online, Adam.
Sure, Chris.
It's have a mic. So
Oh, sorry, Joseph.
Does Adam?
Yeah. No, because we're recording.
Okay. You've covered off a lot of the questions that have come through online, but there's one here. You might not agree with the premise of the question, but it says there's been increasing evidence that far-right ideology has been creeping into green politics and activism. How can we counteract this?
In this country?
I think I would. I mean, it's a pity the person isn't here, because then we could get into a conversation, but I think I would challenge the premise of the question. That's not to say that in years back there haven't been some people from the right who have used the language of environment and going back to nature to pursue very right-wing policies, but I'm certainly not aware of any allegations of any kind of infiltration going on right now. So, yeah, I'm going to disagree with the premise of the question.
Okay. Do we have time for one last from the room? Okay. Does anyone have a fibs? You go. Joseph is handily near you with the microphone.
Hi. So working with businesses as in consulting, you often, well, more and more now, from greenwashing, it's turning to green hushing. And at the same time as, you know, there's a world of fake news, whether it's from government, parliament, wherever. How do we know that when we're trying to lobby our MP, when we're trying to make the change on a local level, that it's actually not, it's authentic? Like, it's such a big question in this entire agenda. It's becoming more like COP27 now, from a lot of activists, is seen as a greenwashing, you know, a stunt. So what would your reaction be to that, or response?
I mean, I would certainly agree with the premise of the question. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that it's getting harder and harder to tell fact from fiction, and there is so much either greenwashing or green hushing, or basically just difficulty in being able to hold companies or governments or MPs to account, because yeah, there is just so much going on that is that isn't accountable. And I don't quite know what my answer to that is. I mean, we can have all of the kind of monitoring organisations that will then, you know, do the analysis to say whether or not a product really is doing what it says on the tin, or whether or not a company is doing that. And in any kind of legislation, I think we need the kind of the checks and balances. But I'm going to.
It comes back to standards.
It comes back to standards, but how do we know that they're actually being?
Yeah, well, it does need a systemic approach. I mean, I suppose my view of it, you know, having come from a place years ago where companies just weren't interested, to at least greenwashing is almost a positive sign that they think this is an important agenda and they would be in on the act, even if not in a good way. That the answer is then to sort of be able to sort the sheep from the goats and evolve the standards. We all need to be vigilant. We have our own standards. There should be maybe
and I think the standards need to be mandatory. I mean, I was just thinking about you mentioned COP27 and I was just thinking about the GFANS initiative, Mark Carney and so forth. And we had Mark Carney in front of the Environmental Audit Committee a few weeks ago. And it's just preposterous, really, when you look. I mean, you know, all credit for trying to do something, but if it's not mandatory, you look through the list of the institutions that are part of that initiative, and they're still investing in fossil fuels hand over fist. So what does it mean? And it's so dangerous, because it just means that all of us end up feeling incredibly disillusioned and disenchanted and disengaged, because we're just dealing with so much crap. So I mean, I think, you know, there needs to be more.
I think that conversation about watering down those standards will lead to a conversation, and certainly in EU circles, about how that becomes something much more carefully monitored and controlled. So I think it's about maturity.
Yeah, but maturity suggests we've got lots of time, and we haven't got lots of time.
Absolutely. No, let's get there quick. Yeah, no, you're quite right. I think we should wrap up, because there are some things to consume at an appropriate level, as it were. Caroline, I can't thank you enough for giving us that overview, that stimulus, that challenge. There's a lot of challenge for us to take away, I think, also from our panellists, and very fair challenge. So thank you. Thank you to the panellists, to all of you, Derek and the IES team, all of the IES team, Ethne, Joseph, Adam, everybody, for putting this together. And very importantly, to the Royal Society of Chemistry for very generously allowing us to use this venue. We are most grateful for that. So I think final round of applause for Caroline and for everyone.
you.